They've given the team a pretty good place to rest, she said as they once again entered the main passage. I'll show it to you, and then I've got some people I've got to see. He nodded without answering. His mind was elsewhere, on his newly discovered delight at being out of the suit. It really did feel marvelous, however frightening it had seemed at first. He flexed his toes in his sandals happily. Shoen stopped abruptly in front of him, turning to speak. He stopped and waited. She, in turn, waited for a small group of people in jumpsuits to pass before speaking. Look, Felix, she began hesitantly. I'm sorry about those kids in the lab. I know they seemed a little... Well, you must understand that for them, this is all very... Canada! Sounded from behind them enthusiastically. As they turned toward the voice, they were surrounded by half a dozen fresh-faced young officer types wearing jumpsuits, too immaculate to be anything other than custom-tailored. They looked like they belonged on the vid, he thought, like actors cast as the fleet's finest. Or, he added wryly, like students dressed up for a party with an ant-war motif. He shrugged uneasily, failed once more to catch most of the names Shoen threw at him. He was ignored for the most part. Canada and her exploits were the center of their attentions, and when they found out she'd seen action... Well, it was really my scout here, Felix, she added, somewhat patronizingly. Tell us about it, urged a pretty captain with a thick Slavic accent. Felix looked at her uncertainly. He had no idea what to say to her. He knew there must be a connection between doing it and talking about it later. It just seemed beyond his reach. Others chimed in with their own urgings, interrupting one another in their excitement. The only response Felix was able to effectively offer was a nod to the oft-repeated question, Seen much combat? Every one of the group seemed to feel the need to ask that particular question. Every one of them got the same nod. And though few noticed, the same helplessly blank stare. Mercifully, they tired of him, and Shoen had things to do. Soon, they were alone. She didn't try to apologize this time. She only smiled nervously. He met the other members of Shoen's team in the overly large quarters assigned to them for off-duty use, a huge rectangular squad bay holding 7 bunks in a space meant for 30. Ling he had met earlier. She had been the one who had actually killed the ant. The other warrior was a huge man named Morleone. I gave you back your rifle, remember? He asked as he shook Felix's hand. Felix remembered, nodded. Shoen looked around. Where's Dominguez? Where's the sergeant? Ling shrugged. Said something about needing more gear. He left as soon as we got here. Shoen frowned at that. She ordered Felix shown the rest of the area, which meant nothing more than Morleone pointing to the door holding the head. Got everything you need in there, Morleone offered. Heads and showers. He shrugged his shoulders and vast muscles rippled. Not like any drop I've ever heard of. Shoen spoke up sharply, almost defensively. Well, okay. Wait here until Dominguez shows up, then get back into your gear. She glanced at a clock on the wall. We'll be seeing it all happen pretty quick. Sun's been up over 2 hours now. Howdy, Colonel, said a cheerful voice. Standing in the doorway was another huge man. He seemed, on first glance, to be fat, but Felix quickly decided it was only because of his enormous barrel chest. You must be Felix, the man said, dropping a packing case heavily onto one of the bunks. He stuck out a hand. I'm Dominguez. Felix shook the hand while Shoen inspected the packing case. What have you got there, Sergeant? She wanted to know. Dominguez smiled broadly. Cigarettes, mostly. He reached inside and selected one of the tubes at random. He looked at Felix. You smoke? Felix nodded eagerly, catching the tube thrown to him. Me too, echoed the two warriors simultaneously. Dominguez waved them toward the case. Shoen looked unhappy. Is that what you've been up to, Dominguez? I thought I told you to check out your quarters. Dominguez smiled easily, unrepentant. "Oh, I did, Colonel, I did." He looked around at the room, "And they're just beautiful." Ling and Morleone grinned. Schoen tried not to, failed. Even Felix smiled. There was something lovable about the sergeant that was undeniable. Felix found himself liking the other man immediately, and then surprising himself by realizing it. Dominguez stepped over to Felix, lit his cigarette for him, said, "So, you're the bully." Felix stared quizzically, wondering what the man meant, and, more importantly, why he was grinning again. "What's the idea of picking on the Colonel's aunt like that this morning?" Felix laughed, shrugged, amazed by it all. Dominguez continued, "I know your type, Felix. Always starting something." Felix tried explaining how he got taken by surprise. "Oh, really?" interrupted Dominguez with loud skepticism. "You trying to tell us that an ant 8 foot tall, weighing 1,000 or so pounds, just kinda sneaked up on you when you weren't looking?" Felix laughed again with the others. "What'd it do, Scout? Tiptoe?" demanded Dominguez, spreading his arms into the air and hunching over. His face screwed up, his eyes bugging out. He pranced several steps around the room in a hilarious imitation of a tiptoeing ant. Ling, Morleone, even Schoen were soon roaring with laughter. Incredibly, Felix found he was laughing right along with them, and for those brief moments, he simply luxuriated in the sensation. Gratefully, blindly. It made no sense, but it had been so long. And then it was over, and he and Schoen were heading back through the corridors to the lab and their armor. Once more they were assaulted by a gang of young, fresh faces, loudly greeting Schoen as the old friend she apparently was. And once more they turned to him, besieging him with questions about the ant, about all ants, about fighting them, and about killing them. He endured it, nodding. The contrast between these up-and-coming and Dominguez was inexplicably striking. He wasn't sure exactly why, but their questions, and their eagerness to question, left him cold and closed. He didn't like being around them, didn't like anything about them. But the reasons for his feelings were as much a mystery as his instant affection for Dominguez. Normally, Felix knew full well he didn't notice people at all, much less have emotional reactions to them. There's something very odd here, he thought to himself, glancing at the passage overhead. Something wrong. The drop itself, this bunker, these people. Me. Especially me. I feel... And that, of course, was it, he realized suddenly. He felt. Ah, come on, what was it, Felix? Exactly how much combat have you really seen? How many drops? Felix looked at the man who had asked the question, disliking him at once. He was somehow too snide and too cynical and too... My God. Envious? "This is 20, Felix snapped without thinking, shouldering past the man and continuing his way down the passage. It was very quiet behind him. He walked several steps, then considered stopping. He wasn't at all certain about where everything was, and Schoen... Then she was there, by his side. "Here," she said, pointing to a cutoff he recognized as the lab hallway. He looked sideways at her as they entered the alcove holding their suits. She didn't speak, but she didn't seem at all displeased. He glanced at his suit, a sudden revulsion surging at the thought of putting it back on, and then, just the thought of it seemed enough. He leaned against the wall and lit the other cigarette he had brought from the squad bay. "That was pretty good," she said suddenly. He looked at her. She was nodding with satisfaction. "Gerald Brunt is an ass." He half smiled, waiting patiently. I don't blame you for saying that to him, she continued. Of course, he'll just go look you up now. He can do it, too. He's got the pool to check most records. And you'll hear from him again, loudly, no doubt. And in public, no doubt. He hates looking like a fool. Felix got it. You mean that last guy? Right. Brunt. I love the look on his face when you told him 20 drops. She laughed lightly to herself. The rest, too. They didn't believe it either. But what could they say? What if it was true? She laughed again, smiling at him. I don't blame you a bit, really. Must get awfully tired of hearing that same question. Bet you've heard it a lot, huh? He shrugged. Never so much as today. Really? She asked. She looked thoughtful. Maybe it makes sense. These guys would be awfully curious about combat, since none of them ever should have seen any. Or mostly none. She looked at him suddenly, grinning. How many drops have you really had? 20, he replied absently. But what are they doing here if they... He stopped when he saw her face. Her voice was very deliberate. Do you mean to say that you really have dropped 20 times? On Banshee? He nodded. Counting this one. That's impossible. He sighed, dropped his cigarette on the floor. Okay. No, I mean it. That can't be. Why? Because it just can't be. How long have you been here? 6 months. 6 months? About that. She stared at him, then looked away, staring still. Gerald Brunt's going to drop dead when he reads that. She looked back at him, a wan smile trying bravely to rise. He's going to wish he'd never even seen you, or even come here for that matter. Colonel, call me Canada, she said quickly. He glanced at her, couldn't read what he saw. Okay. Canada, tell me. You said this guy Brunt and most of the others would never see combat. You mean if they hadn't come here? That's right. Then what are they doing here? She shrugged. They're here to see combat. I don't get it. If they don't have to fight, why would they want to? They don't. Most of them don't. They just want to, well, see it. From the bunker. Oh. She peered carefully at him. Do you understand? I think so. And maybe he did. Or was beginning to. Felix, I know you think this is... Who are they? He asked bluntly. She blinked. Oh, well, that bunch you saw just now are liaison officers. Liaison officers? Observers? Right, for, I don't know, different branches of the services, subcommittees, that sort of thing. He nodded. He looked at her. And who are you? She blinked again. I'm from Militar, Fleet Central. He nodded again. But I'm no observer, she added quickly. I'm here because the bunker was partly my idea. Your idea? Well, it came out of our office, anyway. Operations analysis. It was my idea to have the ants checked after each stage of the battle. She squared her shoulders. Those of us from my office have jobs here. Us. Who else? You saw some of them outside. Ali, Colonel Kadar, he works with... That guy's second in command. He's senior on the command staff. Right, she replied happily, pleased he had remembered, and totally unaware of his reaction. He's never seen combat. Like the rest of you? I don't think so, she replied, thinking. He's dropped before, though. I believe. No, I'm sure he has. What are you people doing here? he asked in a calm, controlled voice. She looked surprised. I told you, Oh, I see what you mean. This is Banshee, after all. It is. Well, she looked very young suddenly. Childlike. Guilty? You have to admit, though, this is the best chance most of us are ever going to get to see combat. I mean, it's perfect here. Perfect. She looked impatient. You know, she insisted matter-of-factly. Safe.